Welcome to In Your Defense, Galveston and Beyond.
Hey, everybody, welcome back to an all new episode of Defense on the Coast with Mark Diaz, a passionate criminal defense attorney with over 25 years of experience defending the rights of Texans. I'm your host, Mike Leon. And in today's episode, we're talking about domestic violence charges in the state of Texas and what people need to know before they ever speak to the police. Mark, good to see you as always. Let's get into this. What exactly does a domestic violence charge cover in the state of Texas?
Well, first, let me say, good to see you. Thanks for having me back. And as far as a domestic violence charge in Texas, it you have to look at the definition of a family member in the family code because it covers boyfriend, girlfriend. It can even cover ex-girlfriend. In other words, it's a very liberal interpretation of domestic violence and family violence and what is considered a family member.
Hmm. Mark, I'm sure people are listening to this and they're thinking to themselves how quickly a simple argument can potentially turn into a criminal case once the law enforcement gets involved. Can you kind of explain that process of once law enforcement gets involved, how this could evolve into a criminal case?
Well, sure. The problem that, when we're talking about family violence, domestic violence, you're talking about one side, possibly both sides having a lot of emotion, right? Because of the nature of the personal relationship, and then what has now caused a situation to come up that involves law enforcement. And so, because of that emotion, when law enforcement becomes involved, it is possible that one of the parties does or says things in front of law enforcement that escalates the situation in the eyes of law enforcement.
So, Mark, let me ask you then: what happens once the police arrive? Are they required to make an arrest, even if the alleged victim doesn't want to press charges?
That can be the situation. And I can give you two uh, good examples. One is if the officers see physical injury, right? If you're talking about what we think typically of the typical domestic violence situation, it would be a husband and wife, boyfriend, girlfriend, a man and a woman, right? And if the police show up in response to a call and see injuries on that female, it is almost guaranteed that that male is going to jail, regardless of if the woman is saying, I don't want to press charges. If the police see injury, it's going to happen. I have, I had a case. Um, I'm not going to use any names, but there was a family function, and my client, her husband, got into an argument with her brother. And it was an argument that escalated to the point of someone calling the police. So when the police get there, they cuff the two men trying to figure out what's going on, right? In other words, they're just detaining them. No one's going to jail yet. Well, my client, the woman, was so mad at her husband that while he's standing there in handcuffs, she walks up and hits him in the face. and, and the officers literally laughed. It's on body cam. And they said, I have to take you to jail now. It's on my body camera what you just did. And so she got taken to jail. I later got the case dismissed, but it was just, a funny circumstance.
Yeah. That is a funny circumstance. So let me ask you though, Mark, because a domestic violence arrest in that scenario you just mentioned, will that affect things like maybe ownership of a gun, custody? Are there things that get affected even before there's been a conviction?
Most of the times, yes. And what I mean is, in domestic violence cases, the court will place bond conditions that you cannot own or possess a firearm or ammunition while you're on bond. Okay, so that would affect it before a conviction. Obviously, they are affected if you are convicted. And this is something that a lot of people don't know, but basically, if you take a conviction for a family violence offense, you're going to lose your gun rights for at least 5 years. And I have literally seen men go to trial on cases that are almost impossible to win simply because they don't want to lose their gun rights because they're big hunters. So
Right.
it definitely impacts some cases more than others because obviously it depends on your particular circumstances.
Yeah. Would make sense in that scenario. Mark, let me ask you, someone listening to this right now, they've been accused of domestic violence. They haven't been charged yet. What advice would you give to them in terms of speaking to counsel? Like, what should their next move be?
Well, obviously, I'm going to say speak to counsel, but the more important thing is to exercise your right to remain silent, meaning you don't have to give any statements to the police. And as I've said before, and I'll continue to say, but you do that respectfully. You just say, I prefer not to speak without the presence of my attorney. Um, you don't have to be a jerk about it because that just escalates the situation and potentially, elevates the officer's sense of urgency.
All right. Mark, a second ago, you mentioned about how these cases are so emotional filled. They have conflicting stories, a lot of he said, she said in that example you gave. How do you approach building a defense in a typical case like that doesn't have any witnesses?
So, most of the time, that is the situation that we find ourselves in because a lot of times these types of cases don't happen out in public with witnesses. So it depends. It depends on what the story is. If someone says they got hit in the face, well, the officers, when they arrive on scene, they're going to not only are they going to take pictures, but their body cams will be on. So we look at the demeanor of the person that's the complaining witness. We look at if they say they were struck somewhere, is there any evidence of that? Is there any evidence of torn clothing? So, in other words, we look for ways to attack what was said by one party. And that's why I say it's better for you not to speak to the police because if you give an interview or give a story or give a statement, I'm stuck with that statement. Whereas if you exercised your right to remain silent, I'm not stuck to a particular narrative and I can just attack what the other side is saying.
Mark, I would love for you to break down as well for the audience the differences between misdemeanor and felony domestic violence charges in the state of Texas.
The big difference is obviously the range of punishment. In a misdemeanor, you're possibly facing up to a year in the county jail. But more often than not in misdemeanor, you know, if it's a guilt situation, we're probably looking at some type of probation or deferred adjudication. But then obviously with a felony, you're looking at the possibility of going to prison uh, versus, a misdemeanor. So the impact on your future is going to be quite a bit heavier if you're convicted of a felony than if it were a misdemeanor.
Mark, in your experience, what are some common misconceptions you've seen play out from folks about how these cases actually play out? What are some common misconceptions out there for people that you can dispel?
I wouldn't. So, some common misconceptions are the police get called a lot when, in my opinion, they should not have been. In other words, sometimes people think, ooh, if I call the police, they'll just make him leave. If I call the police, they'll just make her leave and no one's going to go to jail and it'll be fine. But then when the police get there, whatever, throughout their investigation, someone ends up going to jail when that's not actually what the calling party wanted. What they really wanted was just for someone to diffuse the situation and make the parties separate. A lot of times these cases may involve alcohol, right? And so sometimes one party just wants the other party to go sleep it off somewhere other than home so we can quit arguing. So they call the police and then he or she ends up going to jail. And that's not what was originally wanted. And so I see that a lot.
Yeah. Mark, as we land the plane on this episode, a piece of advice you would leave somebody out there listening to this about the most important step right now that they could take to protect themselves as they face this kind of accusation would be?
I'm in Galveston, and we have misdemeanors and felonies, and in every misdemeanor court in Galveston, uh, the judges start their docket. Before they call the docket, they tell everyone in the audience that they have three options. One is to get a reset to hire your own attorney. The second option is to speak with the DA yourself. And then the third option is to see if you qualify for a court appointed attorney. One of them even sort of encourages you to speak to the district attorney because they say, if you think maybe you want to speak to them just to see what they have to say, but then get a lawyer, you could do that too. My issue with that is that, again, like I said, you could lose gun rights, right? Well, the district attorney's office is not going to tell you that because they're not there to represent you. What they're there to do is convict you. And so if you're going to go talk to the DA by yourself and he says, hey, man, I'll give you time served, which means no time in jail. You're just going to pay for your court costs. And the guy in front of him thinks that sounds great. You mean I can be done with this whole deal today and just pay money? And they say, yeah. And then he leaves. Well, guess what? Deer season starts November 1st this year. You just ended your hunting season. But that's the dangers of representing yourself. So when I say, hire a lawyer and then I laugh, I'm really not being funny. There are collateral consequences to convictions that could affect areas of your life you're not anticipating.
Yeah, very well said. Mark, thank you so much for the time and insights on this. We appreciate it as always.
Thank you for having me. Thank you.
And thank you to everybody out there listening to this installment of Defense on the Coast with Texas criminal defense attorney Mark Diaz. If you want to connect with Mark and the team, do me a favor, visit texascriminaljustice.com today. And don't forget to like this episode, leave a review and comment, or share it with somebody who needs to hear it. As always, I'm Mike Leon. We'll see everybody next time.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to hit that like and subscribe button and leave us a review in the comments.